Well, welcome to lecture number 108, I think, of our guide for the perplexed. The page numbers I'm doing is from the Shlomo Penis version, volume 2. We're on page 490. We're about to study chapter 23. Rambam is in the middle of his analysis of Sefer Iyov, the book of Job. And we all learned last chapter when we studied 22 together. He explained to us um, the concept of Satan as a force of nature, which comes from the physical matter of that which we are made of. And we discussed that was what we were coming off of. And he promised us he's going to talk to us about what the Sefer Iyov is all about. So this chapter 23 is kind of, in many ways, a summary of Sefer Iyov. And for those of you that haven't studied Sefer Iyov, and I did recommend to all of you that you read it last week, but in 1 week to study the whole thing would be quite a challenge. But you get a lot of value out of this chapter no matter what, but you get much more value if you had studied Iyov at some point in your life. So again, I'll cannot reiterate it enough. Read the book of Job, the Sefer Iyov. Read it, study it, and you will not regret it, I promise. So anyway, so this next chapter really. So again, I mentioned last time, and I told you the general structure of the book for those of you that are unfortunately not familiar with it. The structure of the Sefer Iyov is the first two chapters discuss first God mentioning to his heavenly court, telling everybody, "Look at my son Iyov, my servant Iyov. He's such a wonderful guy. He's so righteous. He's so good. Everything is perfect." So, and then Satan challenged him and said, "Yeah, of course he's perfect. He's got everything going for him. Why wouldn't he be perfect? He wouldn't be so grateful to you and so give so much praise to you if you would let me, if you." So then God allowed Satan um, to take away all of his wealth and to take away all and to kill his children and then eventually to make him sick and ill and suffering from the most awful of illnesses and lying in the dirt covered in boils, having lost everything, his status in the community, everything. And then those are the first two chapters, and then we have like 35 chapters or so of Iyov's friends. First, he has three friends who come: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Tzofar come to visit him, and they initially, try to comfort him, but all three of them basically take up the position that if you're suffering, you must deserve it, right? I'm very much summarizing here. Obviously, in 33 chapters, there's a lot more than just this sentence that I just said. But to summarize it, and the Rambam is going to summarize it a little better than me, but I'm saying it anyway, just so that you can understand the structure of this chapter. And if you deserve it, then there must be, you must approach God with repentance. And Iyov insisted that I know I'm innocent. I know I haven't done anything wrong. I've been honest. I've been trustworthy. And even if I did have some tiny little, transgressions here and there, nothing that could possibly describe and justify the horrific suffering that I'm going through. So, and that argument went on, and then at the end, another friend came on board, a fourth friend named Elihu, who it seemed like he was coming in, the way it's structured, he's coming in to say something new, some new idea. But Elihu said for several chapters, he gave a whole speech really talking about the wonders of God's world and this and that. And it's not clear exactly what Elihu is adding, and the Rambam is going to tell us his approach to what Elihu is adding. Um, I recommend you listen to my own podcast, Let the Prophet Speak, to see how I understood Elihu, which is, of course, very heavily influenced by Rambam, which shouldn't be a surprise to you. And then at the end, God gives a long speech, and then at the end, Iyov says to God, "I realize that I was wrong, that and I realize that your ways are good, and I now have knowledge." And then God, the last few verses, God restores Iyov's wealth, and he eventually has children again, and he's everything's hunky dory in his life again. So there's a lot of issues, of course, in a very important book of the Torah, of Tanakh, of the Bible. But I just summarize it to you so you understand the structure, so that we can really kind of get a handle on how Rambam is going to deal with this book. So if we start on chapter 23, page 490, the last paragraph. If it was supposed that the story of Job happened, the first thing that occurred was a matter on which there was general agreement between the five. I mean, Iyov and the friends, namely, in other words, assuming that Iyov did actually happen, right? Or in other words, or whether or not, I'm going to look a little, I like the translation of the new version that you guys sent me, which says, when these things happened or are supposed to have happened, right? Right. So regardless of whether they actually happened or not, doesn't matter. The Rambam keeps on throwing in there because he already told us that he doesn't believe that it's reporting an actual event that actually occurred. That he made clear. But it's fine whether it did or not is not the point. Regardless, there's one thing that they all seem to have agreed, and that is that everything that had befallen Iyov was known to him, meaning God, may he be exalted, and that God caused these misfortunes to befall him. They made the assumption that God knew everything that was happening, right? And that God was responsible for everything that was happening, right? Now, all of them were also agreed. They also agreed that injustice was not permitted to him and wrongdoing not be ascribed to him. They all started with the assumption that God would be just, right? And that God would only do things that were just, and he wouldn't be doing something that's wrong. So you will find these notions frequently also in the discourse of Iyov. In the arguments back and forth and the discussions, you'll find these ideas expressed. If you now consider, if I'm at the top of page 491 now, the discourse of the five in the course of their conversation, you may also think that whatever one of them says is said also by all the others, so that the same notions are repeated and overlap. Over and over again, you'll hear these ideas expressed in all sorts of eloquent ways. But the idea that God is just, God knows what's happening, and God is responsible for what's happening to Iyov. So when you make all those assumptions, you're also going to make certain conclusions, and you're going to end up with certain problems. So they are interrupted as they have these discussions by Iyov, by Job's description of the sufferings and misfortunes that had befallen him in spite of his outstanding righteousness, and by the description of his justice, the nobleness of his character, and the goodness of his actions. Iyov kept on insisting, I'm a good guy, right? I'm a good dude. I've been living a good life. I don't deserve this. So the others, because of all the assumptions that we just said, that God knows, God is responsible, and God is just, they therefore concluded that Iyov must not have been such a great guy, right? And he must have deserved it. That's their logical conclusion. Iyov, on the other hand, looked at himself. He knows honestly that he is a good guy, right? And we know, see, this is the thing is, Iyov doesn't know in the story, the way it's presented, that God himself testified to Iyov's innocence, right? So we know that because we're reading the book, but Iyov doesn't know that God himself attests to it. So we know that Iyov is right when he insists that he's innocent. And we know that he's not suffering because he's being punished for wrongdoing, because the book explicitly told us that he's suffering because God allowed Satan, or in the way Rambam explained to us last chapter, God allowed nature to cause this, to bring about this suffering. In nature, strife between human beings, the forces that run this world caused Iyov to suffer. We know that God allowed that to happen. In other words, God simply allowed the run of the world to take its course. Right? Remember, that's how we explained what Satan meant, according to Rambam's understanding in the last chapter. We know that because we're reading the book. We have the bird's eye view. Iyov didn't, so he kept on insisting, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. So in a minute, we're going to find out, well, what conclusion would you make if you were Iyov in this situation, right? What would be the logical conclusion? Well, I'm not going to give that away. We'll find out on the Rambam in a minute, but let me continue reading. Similarly, they are interrupted in the discourse of his friends by exhortations to patience, words of consolation occasionally, appeals to him to be amicable. They would tell Iyov, calm down. Don't be so mad. You don't be angry at us. We're only trying to help you here. We're trying to help you see the error of your ways. Many of us have had an experience in our life when somebody comes to us and tries to explain to us that you're suffering because you're guilty and you need to fix yourself. and you look into yourself and but I'm not guilty. Don't tell me to fix my, yes, many times we fool ourselves. We think we're not guilty, but sometimes we actually are innocent, right? And other people, and it gets really, really frustrating when they keep, but I love you, I care about you, I want you to fix your ways, but I'm not the one that's wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. You could be saying that because you're a narcissist, but you could actually be telling you the truth. And Iyov, as we know, was telling the truth when he was talking about how innocent he was. But they kept asking him to be patient with them, right? Advice that he ought to be silent and not give rein to his speech like an individual quarreling with another individual. Don't argue with God. He should rather submit to God's judgments and be silent. He, on the other hand, Iyov, says that the violence of the sufferings makes it impossible to be patient. How could you tell me to be patient when I'm lying here in the dirt covered with boils and everything that I ever had in the world was lost, right? And firm, and to say what one ought to. How could you sit here and tell me what I'm supposed to do? What kind of chutzpah, what kind of audacity is that for you to come to me while I'm lying here like this suffering and telling me what I should do? I should be quiet. I shouldn't complain. Who are you? Right? You can understand the argument back and forth, right? All his friends are also agreed that so his friends, they come in and very eloquently describe that everyone who does evil is punished. And that if you see a disobedient man who is fortunate, if you happen to come across a guy who we know is evil, but he happens to be riding high right now, right? In the end, this state of affairs will be transformed into its contrary. Sure, it might look like that, but I promise you, you're going to see that he's going to suffer one day for it. And they bring examples of when it's, because we do sometimes see that. Sometimes people do bad and they eventually think of guys who were rich and wealthy and famous and they were heads of all kinds of things. I'm sure the images of such people come into your mind. You can think of a few names. And then they get caught and they get thrown in jail and they become humiliated and they live the rest of their life in jail with nothing and total nobody. It happens, but not always. But they bring these as examples. And if, however, you see an obedient man in misery, a person who is good and he's suffering, his fracture will certainly be remedied. That's what they insisted that was true. To which Iyov, and this is my own, Iyov keeps responding, it's all wonderful and good, but it's not true. Because I also see me, right? I'm innocent and I'm suffering. How could anyone ever restore my children? They're dead, right? Maybe I'll have more, but the bottom line is my suffering is real. It can't be restored. It can't be fixed. It's never going to come back, right? And Iyov kept on insisting. So you will find this notion repeated in the discourses of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Tzofar, all three being agreed on this opinion. This, however, is not the purpose of the story as a whole. This argument and between them is not the entire purpose of Iyov, right? Rather, in other words, it takes us through this process, this painful, difficult, terribly emotional argument between them, back and forth and back and forth. Its purpose is to show the peculiarity of each of them, to make known each one's opinion concerning the story. I want you to know, Rambam is telling us Iyov was written in such a way so that we should understand each one of these, understand how they came to the conclusions that they came to, and understand why they were wrong, right? Understand what the flaws were in each one of their arguments, right? Everything they started with sounds like such a lofty idea. What religious person would say God is not just? Right? What religious person would say, God doesn't know what's going on? What person would say, God, but meanwhile, those very assumptions that they started with ended up in massive mistakes, right? Which is the point of the book. I'm sorry. So this, however, was not the purpose. The purpose is to show each of them and make known each one's opinion, namely, that the greatest and heaviest misfortunes befall the most perfect individual, who was the most unblemished of them in righteousness, right? Each one opinions, right? It's trying to explain how they explained this situation. Iyov's opinion on this is that this happening proves that the righteous man and wicked are regarded as equal by him, may be exalted, because of his contempt for the human species and abandonment of it. Iyov's initial conclusions, while he was arguing with them, was, what's the logical conclusion of the guy who knows he's innocent but he's suffering anyway? It must be that God doesn't care, right? So Iyov was challenging God and saying, I'm innocent and I'm suffering. This makes no sense. What was the point of all of that life that I lived? I did everything for you, God. I did everything to live the right way. and I still live like this, you must be that you don't care, right? And that's the logical conclusion. If A plus B plus C in Iyov's case equals D, which is God doesn't care, right? This is what he says in all of his speeches. It is all one. Therefore, he destroyed the innocent and the wicked. If the flood slay suddenly, he will mock at the calamity of the guiltless. God will even laugh at those that are guiltless, but suffer a calamity nonetheless. He says thus that if a torrent comes suddenly killing all those it meets and sweeping them away, he laughs at the calamity of the innocent. That's one of the statements that Iyov said in the throes of his pain. Thereupon he confirms this opinion in his dictum: one dieth in his full strength, being wholly at ease and quiet. His pails are full of milk and so on, and another dieth in bitterness of soul and has never tasted of good. They lie down alike in the dust. Everyone in the end ends up in the same place as Iyov. They all end up in the dust, and the worm covereth them. They all get eaten by the same worms, and it doesn't matter if you do good, it doesn't matter if you do bad. We all end up in the same place. He also begins to cite as proof, and I'm about to turn to page 492, the good fortune and the prosperity of the wicked, treating at great length on this subject. He says, even when I remember, I am affrighted, and horror taketh hold on my flesh. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, wax mighty in power, while I'm lying here in the dirt suffering, right? Where's the wicked people? Where's the dishonest people? They're sitting in their towers, right, enjoying life, right? Their seat is established in their sight, and so on. Having described this perfect prosperity, he begins to say to his interlocutors, he says to the three friends, even supposing matters are as you think. So you're encouraging me and telling me, no, don't worry. The wicked will eventually suffer, right? The good will eventually get rewarded, right? But how does that help, right? And the children of the prosperous unbeliever perish after he is no more and their traces vanish. In what way is that prosperous man harmed by what happens to his family after he is no more? They told him, oh, don't worry, he's going to have such a bad reputation that after he dies, his family is going to just wither away and go. Who cares? The guy was living healthy and everything and great and rich and a big place and everything, and he was a total evil person, and he died. So what's the difference that we now remember him, as having been a bad person, and his memory? Who cares? Iyov says, right? What's the difference? For what pleasure hath he, and so on. So thereupon he begins to make clear that there is no hope after death, and that nothing remains but neglect. Accordingly, he begins to wonder how it is that he has not neglected in the origin the work of the generation and the creation of the human individual, and neglects to govern him. Why is it that he even created human beings? He created human beings. We have ability to live our lives, whether good or bad or somewhere in between, right? Hast thou poured me out as milk and curdled me like cheese? You just dumped me. You made milk and you just poured me out, right? You produced me and you plunked me on the earth, and you don't really care what I do, what I live, whether I'm good, whether I'm bad, whether I suffer, whether I don't suffer. You don't care. These are conclusions that Iyov processes that anyone going through what Iyov went through would go through in their mind, right? And in their heart. This is one of the opinions believed in concerning providence. This is, remember, the opinion of, it's kind of a combination a little of the opinion. Remember when Rambam listed a bunch of chapters ago the 5 different ways to understand providence, the first one he mentioned was that of Epicurus, right? Of Epicurus, who said that maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, but if there is, he doesn't care what happens, right? That was one conclusion you could make based on observations from the world, right? The world that doesn't follow the kind of justice that we'd expect to see, right? You'd say, well, God doesn't care. But it's also Aristotle, remember, because Aristotle said that God only cares, has providence over the species. In other words, over the laws of nature that govern how the human species propagates itself and continues to go on existing, and cats propagate themselves and continue to go on existing. But he doesn't really care what happens to every individual cat, and doesn't really care what happens to every individual person, right? That was also Aristotle's idea. So the dictum of the sages that this opinion of Iyov's is most unsound. But this idea that Iyov claimed at the time, we know what the Chazal say that how this was a bad idea. If you know from the Gemara, the Talmud in Maseches Bava Batra on 16a and b discuss the book of Iyov, and they mention a couple of things. So for starters, I'll quote a little bit of Gemara and Bava Batra on 16a. So So Eretz Nitna Biad Rasha, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Bikesh Iyov lahafoch ka'ara al pia. Iyov wanted to turn the plate upside down, right? Right. In other words, but when he said that Eretz Nitna, the land is given in the hands of the evil, so Iyov turn the plate upside down is a metaphor. It's a way of saying he just flipped. He was basically saying heresy, right? Because he's saying that God gives everything to the evil people, right? And then he wanted to upset the plate, and they say Iyov denied the resurrection of the dead, right? Because he said everyone ends up in the same place, right? And meanwhile, the resurrection of the dead would have you say that no, the good people have a future despite the fact that they go to the grave, right? And with regard to his saying, they also say he began to blaspheme because of his suffering. With regard to this saying, may be exalted to Eliphaz, for ye have not spoken me the thing that is right, and my servant Iyov has, and so on. They said to find excuse for it, saying, a man is not to be blamed for what he does when suffering. That's on 16b. I'll read that to you in the original. Give me a second. So they say, Amar Rava says, Mikan she'ein adam nitfas b'shas tzaro. A person cannot be blamed for that which he says when he is suffering. Okay, so meaning that he was excused because of his great suffering. However, this kind of speech does not accord with the parable. Even though it's true that that the Gemara said that, the Rambam often does this, we've had it several times, but here he says it straight up. He disagrees with what the Gemara says, right? Remember, the Rambam holds that we're not beholden to what the Gemara says in Agada. When the Gemara talks, when it's a non-law manner, when it's just speaking about ideas, philosophical ideas, ethical ideas, we don't have to agree with that what the Chazal say, which is what the rabbis say in the Talmud. So the Rambam is saying here, they're wrong, right? That's not the point. I'll explain to you the point, right? What's going on here with Iyov, right? The cause of this is, as we shall now explain to you. I'll tell you what Iyov is doing and what's happening right here. And this is what's happening. Iyov had given up his opinion, which was most mistaken, and had demonstrated that he had been mistaken therein. This view was such as arises at the first reflection and in the beginning thereof. I'm going to explain this in a minute. Especially in the case of one whom misfortunes have befallen, while he knows of himself that he had not sinned, which is not denied by anyone. For this reason, this opinion is ascribed to Iyov. So I want to read to you from the New Translation. I'm gonna so that because it comes out much better. It's just much more clear. So hold on a second. Let me find it. So he quoted Chazal, and then he says as follows, and this is from this version, this translation here, the Len Goodman and Philip Lieberman translation here, and I'm on trade, page 403. So he says, he says about Chazal, but that does not fit the story. In other words, Chazal's explanation that I just read to you does not fit the story. Rather, as I shall now explain, it was because Job recanted and refuted his grave error. What happened here was that Iyov realized that he was making a big mistake. It was, of course, the first thought one would have, especially if stricken with tribulations and conscious of his own innocence, as no one denies. Anyone who knows he's innocent and is suffering like that would first have such thoughts, right? So Iyov was not blaspheming anything. He was going through the natural process that any human being going through such suffering would go through. And the first thoughts that would go through your mind is that God doesn't care, right? And that's just a natural process that, I presume that, God forbid, that any of us should ever have to suffer anything even at all, let alone anything like Iyov suffered. But if we do suffer, that's the first thought. I don't deserve this, right? What did I do to deserve this? Maybe God doesn't care, right? But he said this while still unenlightened. The point is that Iyov said this before he was enlightened. And in the rest of this chapter, he's going to talk about what happened. How did Iyov get enlightened? What does that mean that he was enlightened? Knowing God only by faith, as the pious masses do. What Iyov knew then was he knew God by faith as the general public knows. The general public looks and thinks of God right? In all of the ways that we just described, they think of God, right? What as by faith alone, not by reason, right? Faith as opposed to reason. In other words, they believe that God exists. They believe that God is knowledgeable about everything that's happening. They believe that God is responsible for everything that's happening. And they believe that he is just. And therefore, if all that's true and you're suffering despite being innocent, what are you going to conclude? You're left with nothing other than to either conclude that you're guilty. But if you know that you're not guilty, the next thing to do is you're going to have to drop one of those assumptions and say, well, he must not be just. So if you have a simplistic understanding of God, then suffering will make you blaspheme, will make you make statements like that, because that's the logical conclusion. But once he knew God with certainty, once he really understood God with his mind and understood God in truth, he realized that true happiness, real happiness, is not to be found in being comfortable and healthy and having wealth and having children and having a great name and having a great reputation. But real happiness is now, which is knowledge of God, which is assured to all who know him. That happiness is assured to all who know him, no matter what kind of suffering you're going through. And that's the realization that Iyov finally had at the end of the book. He's going to reiterate this more. So just take the point, but we're going to get into it in a little bit more depth. They are untroubled when they undergo all such disasters, no matter how many disasters you go through. When you recognize what real happiness is, and that's something that you have to intellectually understand, it's not something that you can achieve by blind faith alone, right? It's not something you can just, but rather it's something that you need to internalize and really understand. When you get it and you realize that you have happiness in that knowledge, then you can find happiness despite all of the troubles, because you realize that the goal of life isn't to have physical comforts, have all of those things that you're asking for, that most people ask for. So now that we said this, I'm going to go back to the old translation, because I know that's the one that most of you have in front of you. So I'm at the bottom. So, but when he knew God with a certain knowledge, he admitted that true happiness, right? So I'm at the top of page 493, right? While he had known God, right, only through the traditional stories, all he knew was he read all the Bible stories, right? But right, he read all the traditional stories, but not by the way of speculation, but not because he really spent the time to understand what God really means. All he had was the stories. Right? Job had imagined that the things thought to be happiness, the things that he thought were sources of happiness, such as health, wealth, children, are the ultimate goal. So therefore he thought, I'm going to live a good life, so I should get all of those things, right? And when he thought that for this reason, he fell into such perplexity and said such things as he did, right? That's why he couldn't understand, right? If that's what good is, why don't I have good? I've been living life correctly. I should have good, right? Why don't I have it? It makes no sense. This is the meaning of his dictum when Iyov said at the end of the story. What did Iyov? What's his final statement? I had heard of you, right? I've heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, that now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent of dust and ashes. Iyov finally said, now I see, now I hear, now I understand. It was understanding, it was wisdom that Iyov achieved that helped him realize his own humility. Remember, I emphasized so many times how the underlying theme of this entire book is what Rambam is asking us to realize, that we are but dust and ashes. We are just humble. When we recognize that, and our goals are not health and wealth and children, but our goals are knowledge of God, and that's the source of true happiness, then all of this other stuff, then the questions fall away, right? This dictum may be supposed to mean, wherefore I abhor all that I used to desire and repent of my being in dust as ashes. This being the position that he was supposed to be in, and he sat among the ashes. It is because of this final discourse, indicative of correct apprehension. It was because of his final words in the end, when he finally got it, that it is said of him after this, for ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Iyov has, right? You, the others, and because at the end of the story, God spoke to the three friends and said, you have not been speaking correctly of me as Iyov has been. It wasn't referring to all of Iyov's speeches when he was going through all the suffering. it was referring to Iyov's final speech where he recognized that it's understanding, it's contemplation, it's recognizing God. That's the true happiness. When Iyov finally got that, that's what he got that the friends didn't get and the friends didn't understand. So now that we get this, if you don't mind for a moment, I'm going to go off track for a second because I just can't help myself. And please, if I upset anybody, I'll ask forgiveness in advance. But if you don't forgive me, fine. There's a very popular song today bouncing around Israel that became the source of some controversy. And if any of you scroll through TikTok or Facebook Reels or whatever your social media nonsense is, you'll see all these things of Israeli kids and a lot of Orthodox kids singing Odio Ter Tov. It'll be better, good, good. God loves me, right? And it's going to be good and good and good. And in the song, it lists the good things. I could almost list the lyrics. And there's a whole philosophical debate about whether this song is a great, wonderful song that helps people feel upbeat, or is it heresy? Well, without taking sides so much, right? Hashem yitbarach tamid ohevoti. God always loves me. V'tamid yeli rak tov. It's always going to be good. V'yeli odio ter tov. V'odio ter tov. It's going to be even better and even better, and it's always going to get better, right? And then he even lists, right? He says, God's going to listen to my prayers. And what is it going to be? V'tiyeli parnasa. I'm going to have a livelihood. In other words, I'm going to have wealth. V'tiyeli ashirut. I'm going to have wealth. Urvakim urvakot, and the single boys and girls, I'll find a wife or a husband. I'll have health and I'll have healing, right? I'll have honorable life and so on. The Rambam just said that that's not what good is, right? So whether or not you like the song or not, it is diametrically opposed to what the Mor Nevuchim stands for, right? And it's diametrically opposed to, and so I listen to this song. It's the most non-Maimonidean. So if you like it, fine. Just remember that if you like singing that song and that's what makes you happy, then you are doing the opposite of what the Rambam is telling you. We learn from not just the Rambam, but that's what the lesson of the book of Iyov is. I remember the book of Iyov is a book in Tanakh. It's part of the Bible. Last I checked, it was in my Bible. I don't know if it's in yours, but it was in mine. So according to the Rambam, the Torah teaches us that philosophy is wrong. And just absorb that for a minute. And yes, I am speaking against the song. I'm not the only one. There are others that followed the same line as me. Meanwhile, the song has a very catchy tune and it gets everybody all excited. So what could I do? Such is life. Not everybody reads the Mor Nevuchim. But it's like the Rambam literally listed the things and says that is not good. That is not what happiness is, but this song seems to think otherwise. All right. So much for that one. Anyway, now let's go back to the Mor Nevuchim. I'm sorry, I apologize for the sidebar there. But the opinion of Eliphaz concerning this event. So now the Rambam is going to focus on the three friends. So all three friends, come to the conclusion that Iyov must be guilty, right? But each one with a slightly little twist, and each one kind of represents the approaches towards providence that the Rambam didn't like, right? That he mentioned already before. So I'll read through these relatively quickly. So the opinion of Eliphaz concerning this event is also one of the opinions professed concerning providence. It's one of the other opinions, right? As you said, Iyov himself seemed to be expressing some combination of Epicurus and Aristotle until he recognized the truth at the end. But while he was arguing with his friends, that was the opinion that he took. Eliphaz is another one, for he says that everything that befell Iyov was deserved by him, for he had committed sins because of which he served these misfortunes, right? He basically blamed you. He says, you must have done something really bad, right? So think about it, and it has to be. You must have sinned, right? And it's ironic. It's meant to be ironic when you read the book, because you and I know that he wasn't. So we're reading Eliphaz berating Iyov, and we feel the pain. It's like twisting our hearts. But you want to like bop Eliphaz over the head and say, but God himself said that he was innocent. I know it. But Eliphaz didn't have access to God's heavenly court, and we do, because we got the book, right? But so this is what he says, is that is not thy wickedness great, right? It's not, they're not that iniquities, not, you must have terrible sins. And he starts enumerating imaginary sins that Iyov must have done. Then he began to tell Iyov, the righteousness of your actions and your excellent way of life upon which you relied do not entail your being perfect before God, so that you should not be punished. You think you did such a great life. That's not enough because of the sins that you must have done. Behold, he puts no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with authority. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust. In other words, even the great, great, great angels, if they make a mistake, God takes it against them. Imagine you're just a human being. Of course you have human sins. Eliphaz does not cease turning around this notion. I mean to say, he believes that everything that befalls a man is deserved, but that the deficiencies for which we deserve punishment and the way in which we deserve punishment because of them are hidden from our perception. In other words, you might think that you're innocent, and you might think that your transgressions aren't great enough to warrant the suffering, but clearly it was, right? So that corresponds to some of the opinions that Rambam mentioned before. The opinion of Bildad, the Shuchite, that's the second friend, consists in the belief in compensation, right? He emphasizes the idea that of compensation, of repayment. For he says to Iyov, if you are innocent and have not sins, right, the reason for these great events is to make great your reward. He takes another approach, which the Rambam, for the most part, rejected before, right? Which is, he's making you suffer now so that later, so that you'll get better reward, if indeed you are innocent, right? You will receive the finest of compensations. All this is good for you, so that the good, so revel in your suffering, because it's great, because it means down the road, you're going to have a bigger piece of cake, right? You're going to have it's going to be more wonderful down there because of what you're suffering now, right? That's what he says to Iyov, if thou art pure and upright, and so on. You already know how well known this position on the subject of providence is. We already made it clear. We talked about this approach, and we discussed it before, right? The opinion of Tzofar, Tzofar HaNamati, that was the third of the three friends, is the one that considers that everything follows from the will alone, right? That it's all about God's will. Remember, Rambam brought, I forget the name of one of the Islamic schools of thought, right? That no reason whatever should be sought for his actions. Everything that God does, he does, and we should never question why, right? It's God's will. Whatever it is, it's God's will, right? So why did he do this and why did he not do that? That question should not be posed. For this reason, the point of view of justice or requirement of wisdom should not be sought in whatever it is. Don't start thinking, why am I suffering if I don't deserve it? We don't know why God does. He just does what he does. Right? We are incapable of penetrating the secrets of his wisdom, which necessitates his doing what he wills without there being another reason. Right? That's his will. This is what he says to Iyov, that God would speak and open his lips against thee, and that he would tell these secrets of his wisdom, that they may teach thee doubly. All of these things, so on. That's just finishing the first chapter on the top of page 494. So those are the three opinions that were pumped out by the three friends of Iyov, none of which approached the real answer, right? The real answer, which is the Rambam's understanding, which he told us. The real answer being, understand the true happiness comes from knowledge of God, and understanding that God's knowledge and our knowledge are two completely different things. So there is truth, kernels of truth in everything that these friends were saying, right? There is truth in it being God will, right? But we have to, it's not just not questioning his will, but it's understanding that his will is of a completely different nature than ours, appreciating that, internalizing that, and feeling happy in that knowledge. Now, it doesn't look like I'm ever going to be able to finish this chapter, but I would love to, but it doesn't look like it's possible. But I'm going to continue a little more before I open the floor. So know then, right? So I'm going to finish this next paragraph, and then next week we'll start with Elihu. Elihu is the fourth friend who comes in and says a new point, something that will lead us to God's own speech, because the book ends with God's speech. And Rambam is going to say Elihu kind of leads us to God's speech, and then the lesson which finally sunk into Iyov, which he already told us what it is. But remember, we're going to get into a little more detail. He's going to, as he discusses Elihu and he discusses God's speech, it'll lead us more towards the conclusion. We'll understand it on a deeper level. So hang in there. But let me just do this paragraph. Know then and consider how the story which has perplexed people is composed, and called upon them to adopt the various opinions that we have analyzed above concerning God's providence regarding the created things. All of this discussion until now, Iyov with Bildad, Eliphaz, and Tzofar, that entire discussion with the book of Iyov takes I remember exactly, somewhere 30 plus chapters, right? All that is required by the classification, the list that I mentioned before, is mentioned and ascribed to one of the men famous at that time because of virtue and knowledge, right? So, in other words, if you assume that they were real people, right, we ascribed these to these people because these people were well known as intelligent people. The Rambam is trying to say that these thoughts aren't stupid, right? There are smart people that say these things because of the reasons that I described, and therefore, in the story, they're ascribed to these wise men. Now, that would have been said if this was a parable, even if they're not real, right? Which the Rambam came pretty firm down on the side that they're not real. It's still the same point, right? Even if it's just completely just a story, just a parable, those three people are mentioned as those that represent the kinds of people that teach those kinds of lessons. Or they might have expressed these opinions in true reality if the story actually did happen. The opinion attributed to Iyov is the opinion of Aristotle, right? Remember, Aristotle, who says that God doesn't have individual providence over individuals. He only has providence over species to make sure that humans have what humans need and do what humans do, and cats, so on and so forth. But he doesn't really care what happens to Saul Weinreb or Joe Smith. He couldn't care less, right? The opinion of Eliphaz is in keeping with the opinion of our Torah, right? Remember, our Torah, before the Rambam introduces explanation of the Torah, right? Remember, that was that everything that God does is just, that he punishes the wicked and rewards the guilty, right? Before the Rambam explained his own understanding of the Torah. If you remember how Rambam structured it, right? He said what the Torah's opinion is, and then he gave his own addition, which, to make it the brief version, is the difference between God's knowledge and our knowledge, which we're going to get to again next week, right? The opinion of Bildad is in keeping with the doctrine of the Mutazila. Remember, those are the two Islamic schools of thought that he quoted before. The opinion of Tzofar is in keeping with the doctrine of the Ashariya. These were the ancient opinions concerning providence. So you have to go back. I don't remember what number lecture it was, but those opinions were back like I don't know, 6 or 7 chapters ago. So I think this is a good stopping point to open the floor for questions. And we're going to get to Elihu and God. Okay? How often do you get to hear God himself speak? So that's one of the cool parts about the end of Iyov, where God gives what I think is God's longest speech in the entire Tanakh, is the last several chapters. So Rambam is going to reference those and end with the conclusion. So anyway, let me open the floor for any comments, questions, etc. Fire away.
Okay.
Yes.
Jeff Burt.
Yes.
Here's my question. And
Sure.
I apologize because I realize that I need to be patient and I shouldn't ask this question now, but it's by my nature to be impatient. On
All right.
on the third view, just quoting it, the third friend, and he says, among other things, we are incapable of penetrating the secrets of his wisdom, which which necessitates his doing what he wills without there being another reason.
Right.
Now, my question is, I thought, anticipating what God's conversation with Job, and I should say some years ago, I took a year's course with Rabbi Frendel on the book of Job every week,
Okay.
which was great. And I should also say that my brother, who died a few years ago, taught a course with the rabbi at Yale for 16 years and wrote a book about it on the idea of injustice. And his focus was Job. So anyway, so I guess I'm saying, isn't the third friend teaching humility, teaching, we don't know what God is doing. There's no way we can decipher him. So why isn't the third friend, and also the God's discussions where he says to Job, where were you when I created the world? And it kind of bangs, tries to say, hey, who are you to question what I do? I do what I do. Isn't the third friend exactly what we're going to find out next week? That's what God says. You humans are incapable of penetrating the secret of his wisdom, and he does what he does without there being.
So
What's the difference?
you're asking an extremely good question, and if you allow me, I'm going to try to paraphrase it, and then I'll answer it. Okay.
Please.
So what you're really asking is, I forget what were those guys? The Mutazila, right? No, the Ashariya, right? Because those are the ones who said, the Asharia are the ones who said that that God's will is God's will and we can't question it, right? Um, there's one thing, okay, so how is that different than saying we don't understand God's justice, right? So right, in other words, we're both saying that we have to accept what God does,
Right.
right? Because that's God's will, right? So I'll tell you the difference, right? And the difference is, and you'll understand it better if you take the bridge. The bridge was when the Rambam introduced us to the Asharia and the Mutazila. I'm sorry, I can't remember what chapter it was, but about 10 chapters ago, right? When he introduced that to us, he said the Mutazila, Asharia, then he said the Torah, and then he said his own view, right? So the Torah was the bridge because the Torah actually teaches us that there is such a thing as justice, right? Right? God is just, right? It's not just about the will of God. It's just. Now, his justice and our justice is not the same thing, right? What you and I think is just, right? So what the mutazi the Asharia, I'm sorry, the Asharia, at least according to the way Rambam is explaining, and I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I can't tell you exactly what the Asharia group really teaches, but the way the Rambam is presenting it, right? The Asharia, they simply, we have to accept God's will no matter what, even if it's not just, right? But you and I have to understand that God is just, but his justice is not the same as our justice. And to think that his justice is the same as ours, that's what's arrogant, right? If we walk around thinking that because I think that Joe, he deserves to get rich, and Jim, he deserves to lose his job and let him suffer because he's a good for nothing and he's a great guy, right? So that's my justice because I like him and I don't like him. Whatever reason I think he's better than him, right? But that's not God's justice. God's justice is a calculation that we cannot even fathom. We can't even, it's not like there are things about Jim and Joe that I don't know that God knows. That's not what it means. That's like a quantitative difference, that God is more just because he knows more than I do. No, it's a qualitative difference. His justice is something completely different than ours. So whatever the reason is, I don't understand and I have to accept, but I also have to accept that it is just. So the difference then is that if you're going to find happiness and satisfaction in a knowledge of God, if you're going to try to do it to an Asharia style God, it's very difficult, right? Because they're basically saying that God isn't just, right? That is not always, there is no real reason for it. It's just God's will. Everything is God's will, right? We have to bend to God's will. We have to accept God's will. And but it's not right. So Rambam is telling us it is right, right? But it's a kind of right. And if we intellectually get that, it's a kind of right that we will never and can never explain. And we should stop trying, right? And just accept that knowledge. And find happiness and satisfaction and goodness in our ability to comprehend that idea and comprehend it on its deepest level, and thus achieve eternity that way. And that's the difference between it. Does that answer the question?
Well, if I can respond, no, because to me it doesn't. At least because what it says is that language becomes meaningless when we're dealing with God. So God speaks one language, and we speak another language, and we'll never be able to communicate.
But language is meaningless when it comes to God. Rambam emphasized that a million times. If I quote from you at the end of this chapter, I'll just tell you 1 second. He specifically deals with that issue of language. I want to find where he says it.
So we just have to live with
But
our
note, this is on 496 on the bottom. We're going to read this next week. But he literally flips right away to language, just as you brought up. And he says, but the notion of his providence is not the same as the notion of our providence, nor is the notion of his governance of the things created by him the same as the notion of our governance of that which we govern. The two notions are not comprised in one definition, right? Contrary to what is thought by all those who are confused. And there's nothing in common between the two except the name alone. We're just using the same language to describe two completely different things.
So I would say that's equivalent to the third friend who says it's all secret, because if we can't communicate with God, the whole thing is bound up in mystery and secrecy. We might as well give up.
No, but it's not, The realization itself that God is an entity that's beyond us is the difference. God is just, but it's a justice that we don't comprehend.
Well, that's, I guess, what I'm questioning. If you say God is just, well, if it a language that we can't even understand, then we don't
Right.
know we don't know what justice is. So let's just give up, and he wills what he wills.
I want to take it a step further, right? If you believe that God is just, right?
That's
But you
the
don't
problem.
understand his justice,
Right.
right? But you have that knowledge, then you still have the because you striving for knowledge of truth, right? You learn more about the world around you, right? You learn how to live in this world, right? And you learn how to live properly in this world. And in the end of the story, you end up living a better life, right? Remember, the Rambam's philosophy extends beyond just the fact that we don't understand God, right? You don't just sit back and accept everything because of the way it is. We can achieve something. And what do we achieve? We achieve through our knowledge of truth. And when we now know and understand truth, we can take actions in this world that actually do make our lives and everyone else's lives better. Remember his example with the ship, right? You know, we can't necessarily control whether or not there's a storm that's going to control the ship, so that sink the ship, right? But we can decide whether or not we should take the risk to go on the ship in the first place, decide how we're going to build the ship, decide how we're going to make sure that the captain is qualified to drive the ship or whatever, ship the ship, whatever it's called, sail the ship, right? We can make sure that the safety record of the ship is good, and so on and so forth. So if you understand that achieving that wisdom about God and God's justice is important, then you keep going after that. That's not where it ends, right? In many ways, you can look at Iyov as exactly that story. It says that Iyov rebuilt his wealth and had more children and everything, right? Many people would have been completely broken. They wouldn't have been able to continue moving. It wasn't just because God said, waved the magic wand and poof, now Iyov is rich again, right? It was, if you look at the story, Iyov went on living despite all of what he had been through. He didn't give up because he achieved that knowledge. If all you do is stick with what the Ashariya are saying, the way the Rambam leaves it, then you sit and do nothing. It's just whatever happens, it's just God's will. God's not just. He's not kind. He's not none of those attributes. Well, I shouldn't have said kind because that's getting into the attributes of God, which is a different subject. But justice is what Rambam is emphasizing here, right? Um, so it makes a difference. It makes a difference, and achieving that knowledge, understanding. Remember how Rambam described. He said we can never understand God, but we can try to understand it by negative attributes, right? By constantly saying what He's not. So what the Rambam is trying to tell us is that by saying that His knowledge is not our knowledge, we're gaining insights into what His knowledge is, right? By constantly cutting away the excess, we get closer and closer to understanding what his knowledge is, and we keep constantly seeking closer and closer to the truth. And we end up living a life that's better, that's more meaningful,
Well,
that's more
I'll put
purposeful.
my perplexity on the shelf to come back later on.
Okay, no, it's good. I understand that I may not have answered it 100%, and we'll see as the Rambam goes through. We'll see if it gets more clear, and if it doesn't, then we'll, like you said, we'll still be perplexed.
So
But
Rabbi Goldman has a question.
yeah, I see Yosef has had his hand up for a while, so fire away.
That's okay. I think that was the longest answer that you ever gave, but kol kavod. But actually, Rambam himself said, "Ilu yadati v'hitiv," that if I knew God, I would be God, right? So
Mhm.
there are limits to our understanding.
Right.
But I wanted to say specifically because you mentioned Eliphaz and Hashem's answer to him. Um, I don't remember which one's which, but in your introduction, you said that all three of them basically said that he must have done something wrong.
Mhm.
My friend Pastor Terry said that one of them said, "You probably did something wrong." The other one said, "You must have done something wrong," and the third one said, "Maybe you did something wrong." So like that's how we divided their approaches, and I never learned it like that, but it was very
It
eye
is,
opening because
yeah, it is interesting. That is an interesting way of putting it. Yeah.
anyway, thank you for letting me share.
Oh no, thank you. Thank you. It is an interesting way of putting it. I've it's worth reading. I'm telling you, because every single one of you will read it and will understand the book a little differently, or maybe a lot differently. But every one of you will walk out wiser at the end than you were in the beginning. And one of the most incredible things about Iyov is it gives you the opportunity to really ask the hard questions. I mean, it's so important. Like when we go through our religious lives, some people unfortunately are taught, this is the way it is. Don't ask questions. And when you read through Iyov, the hardest, most challenging, most difficult, most heretical. I'm going to say that, heretical and things, because the point is that it's not heresy to ask those questions. And Iyov tells you, ask the hard questions, and if nothing else, you'll walk out of the book realizing that that's how we're supposed to live. The fact, and the Rambam told us this very clearly. He said that Chazal, and he basically said Chazal were incorrect in saying that Iyov was making a mistake when he entertained the notion that we all just end up in the grave and there's no such thing as a resurrection, right? Or Iyov said there's no justice in this world, that he was trying to, those weren't heresies. Rambam is telling us those were appropriate under the circumstances, because those are the natural thoughts that any human being would go through. Iyov was going through the intellectual process of a person who's going through some of the worst tragedies a person can go through, and so those are questions that Rambam says, no, that's not heresy to say that. It's the natural consequence. That's what human beings ask. Those are the kinds of questions that we have to deal with. So if nothing else, you'll learn Iyov and you'll understand that that book is in Tanakh. If I may place this forward, obviously, who am I to choose why things are in Tanakh? But I don't think it's a stretch to say it's in Tanakh in order to teach us that we're supposed to ask those questions. We're supposed to go through this process. We're supposed to ask these questions because they're natural, they're normal. This is how we deal with the experiences that we have. And we all probably on a daily basis, obviously not on the level of Iyov, go through like, why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? Like, why do I deserve this? I don't deserve this. Or, I deserve something better. How many times do we think these things? Anyway, I just yeah, but thank you, Yosef, for what you said there. That's a very interesting way of putting together those three friends. And what we're going to understand next week, Lynette and Mish Hashem, we're going to understand how Rambam understands what Elihu added and what God added, and we'll get it. It should be fun. It should be a lot of fun. So, any other comments before I close up?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes.
Do we know if Rambam in his personal life ever experienced any of the pain, the difficulties that were similar to anything close to what Iyov went through?
So it's a good question. I think I did do a little biography of Rambam, and it's worthwhile reading. So obviously the no one can ever compare and say, oh, I suffered as much as you, or you suffered as much as me, because no one knows. But the Rambam had a very challenging life. So just, he grew up, it's debatable exactly how old, but he was probably a teenager when his family had to flee Spain because of the Almohad persecution. Those were a Muslim extremist group that was basically that invaded southern Spain, and they had to run. So as a young man, his family had to run, and exile in those days, he ran to Morocco, where he was forced under a forced conversion, convert or die. He was forced to convert to Islam. He then eventually ran with his family to escape that. And he ran across North Africa eventually to Palestine, or whatever it was called then, and then eventually made it to Egypt. When he got to Egypt, so that's not exactly a life of lap of luxury. And then when the one of the most famously difficult trials that he went through, he had an extremely close relationship with his brother. And his brother, for all we know about him, was a great man who was a successful businessman who actually died in the Indian Ocean on a ship when his merchant ship went down, right? And the Rambam and he was the deal was his brother was going to support him, and that forced the Rambam to leave his life of study and go and make a living as a doctor. But as the story was, the Rambam was so depressed when the news of his brother's death came to him because they were so close that he spent an entire year in abject depression. He spent an entire year barely getting out of bed. That he was so depressed at the loss of his brother. So when he does use that analogy to the ship, we know what he had in mind, right? Because that his brother, lost his life. But despite that year, eventually he managed to get up and he went into business for himself as a physician, and eventually rose through the rest of his life as a physician and the rabbinic leader of the community of Cairo, Egypt, at the time. So, I mean, could say, are there other Jews and other people that have had harder lives than Rambam? Sure, but but he certainly had his share of suffering and understood what human suffering meant. You know, um, and I just I gave a brief biography of Rambam's sufferings, at least what's known to us. So yeah, so he's not talking as someone who lived who grew up in the lap of luxury and never knew a day of want in his life, you know.
No, but he didn't have his entire family suddenly wiped out and lost everything. I mean, everyone loses something,
Right,
someone close to them during
right,
life, and everyone has
right,
some kind of level of hardship. But
right.
what Iyov went to, and we're the way Rambam deals with that. I mean, I think Rambam, from what you said, it doesn't sound like he came close to the level of suffering and loss that Iyov experienced, and that's bothersome to me.
So I
So
want you to know
to say,
this that there are scholars. There's a guy who writes a lot about Maimonides, and I read some of his works named James Diamond. I
sure,
think in
yes,
Toronto. But I remember I listened to him speak once and on online, and he mentioned that a lot of what the Rambam says to a lot of people falls flat when you think about the Holocaust, right? Um, it's easy to say how wonderful true happiness is when you understand God, but then you took a look at the Holocaust and how do there's a level of suffering beyond which that wonderful explanation doesn't work. And it's kind of what it sounds like similar to what you're saying. So if you do feel that way, you're not the only one that went through Rambam and feels like something's missing. That there's something that's this doesn't quite get it. So, but we're not finished with his spiel. But it's a legitimate criticism, and you're not the only person that criticized the Rambam for that. So a lot of people feel that once we saw that kind of suffering, right, that kind of unimaginable suffering, we need something better than more nevuchim. So I don't mean to but on the other hand, we still have to hear what he has to say, and then we'll see what happens. If it ends up being inadequate, then it's inadequate. To keep trying. But
Maybe after we finish, we can learn Ma'amar Emunah B'Tochon of the Chazon Ish, more relevant for our generation.
yeah, that is yeah that there's
But they're all based on the Rambam. They can't. They're not inventing the wheel, as they say. They're just relating in more clear Hebrew language. I don't know. Was it
yeah.
translated to English?
I don't know, but we could do it in Hebrew. I could translate it, but we'll see. We could. I'll put that on the burner.
Right now,
But
it's
we'll get to we have. We'll see. We probably got another year left of more Nevuchim to do together, and then we'll decide what we do next. But no, but Martin, you're making a really good point, and you're not the only one to say that. I mean, it's a good point. That's a very good point. So and we'll keep that on the discussion table, and we'll keep bringing it up. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks for everyone's wonderful attention and for joining us, and looking forward to next week. And have a wonderful evening. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Yasher koach.
All right.
thank you, Saul. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.